Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a landmark court case that, honestly, is often missing from the history books. This was a civil rights battle fought not on a bus or at a lunch counter, but right on the front doorstep.
Because sometimes the most revolutionary act you can take is simply choosing where you want to live. This is the story of how that one single, powerful choice helped to reshape America.
So let's jump in. We're starting with a story you might think you know, but from an angle that is so often overlooked.
And it's true, right? When you think of the civil rights movement, certain powerful images pop into your head. The Montgomery bus boycott, the integration of schools like Little Rock Central High. These are the front lines we all remember.
But here's the thing. Before a lot of those famous events, a quieter, maybe more fundamental battle was being waged. It was a fight over the right to own property and live in a neighborhood of your choice, free from discrimination.
So, how was segregation actually enforced at the neighborhood level? Well, it wasn't just social pressure. It was written into the law of the land, creating these invisible walls around entire communities.
The primary tool for this was something called the Housing Covenant. Now, what is that? Well, it was a private contract, but it had the full force of the legal system behind it. It was a rule literally baked directly into the deed of a house.
And here's how it worked in practice. A racist clause gets added to a property's legal documents. Then, when a black family tried to buy that house, a neighbor could actually sue them. And the courts, the very institutions that are supposed to provide justice, would step in and enforce the discrimination.
And this wasn't some fringe idea. It was a deeply embedded system. Banks would deny loans, a practice we now know as redlining. And the local courts? Well, they saw it as their job to uphold these contracts. It was a powerful system designed to maintain racial boundaries, one neighborhood at a time.
But you know, systems, no matter how powerful they are, they're always challenged by the courage of individuals. And that is exactly what happened here.
This whole massive legal battle, it started with a simple, ordinary dream. A black family had worked hard, saved their money, and found a home they wanted to build a life in. But they were blocked, not because they couldn't afford it, but simply because of the color of their skin.
And that's what's so jarring about this. This wasn't seen as some huge outrage. It was presented to them as the status quo. They were told it was just the way things were, completely legal and totally normal in the eyes of the law at the time.
And this is where the story turns. Instead of accepting this injustice, they chose to challenge the entire system. They decided to take their fight to court, turning their own personal struggle into a national battle.
So now let's move to the courtroom. This wasn't just an emotional appeal, it was a brilliant legal challenge that forced the system to confront its own contradictions.
The case really boiled down to this fascinating legal conflict. On one side, you had the principle of freedom of contract, the idea that private citizens could agree to anything they wanted. But on the other, you had the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection. And the brilliant argument was this: the covenant might be private, but the moment a court enforces it, well, that becomes state-sponsored discrimination.
And you can just imagine how tense the atmosphere was. You had local officials showing up to actively defend segregation. The judges knew their decision wouldn't just affect this one family or this one neighborhood. They were being asked to potentially dismantle a system that had defined American cities for decades. The stakes were absolutely immense. This single case put the American ideal of freedom squarely up against the reality of systemic segregation. The outcome was going to send a message across the entire country.
And that message, when it finally came from the highest court in the land, was a total shock to the system.
In a landmark 1948 decision, Shelley versus Kramer, the Supreme Court ruled, and its conclusion sent ripples through the legal and real estate worlds like you wouldn't believe.
The court actually agreed with the challengers. It declared that while those private covenants could still exist, the courts could no longer enforce them. This basically pulled the teeth out of the entire system. It didn't make headlines like a march or a boycott, but this quiet legal victory was a monumental step forward.
Which brings us to a really interesting question. If this ruling was such a huge deal, why isn't it as famous as, say, Brown versus Board of Education or the March on Washington?
Well, this timeline really puts it all in perspective. The ruling against covenants came way back in 1948. That's years before the more visible, protest-driven events of the civil rights movement that we're all so familiar with. It was a legal battle, fought by lawyers in courtrooms, and it was just overshadowed by the powerful images of mass movements that came later.
But we can't forget its importance. Where we live determines so much. The schools our kids go to, our access to jobs, our ability to build wealth. This case helped open doors.
And it reminds us that the fight for justice doesn't always happen in the streets. Sometimes it happens in the quiet, deliberate halls of a courthouse.
You know, this case really proves that justice often begins with these unseen battles, led by ordinary people who just refuse to accept an unjust reality. And it leaves us with a question. What are the quiet, seemingly invisible fights happening right now that will one day be seen as monumental shifts in our world?